So we are continuing our series in yoga, philosophy, and lifestyle class. This is our second episode or our second part to this series of classes called Patanjali's Eight-Limb Path or Ashtanga Yoga. And tonight, what I'm planning to cover is some of the kind of metaphysical Samkhya metaphysics part of like how the authors and the people who practiced yoga as it was practiced in the Yoga Sutras, how they kind of saw the world, some things that they understood about the world in order to come to this technology of the yoga as it's presented in classical yoga, the Yoga Sutras, and then also kind of show how that relates to the eight-limbed path. And then you'll get to see all eight limbs tonight. We're going to introduce them tonight. And then each week afterwards, we're going to go through one at a time to kind of complete this series. So let's drive forward. Oop. All right. This is the part I told you was going to be a little bit tricksy. This is Samkhya Metaphysics 101, right? And I want to cover two topics. The first is the distinction between gross and subtle bodies. And it's not really a distinction. Think of it more as continuum. So everything in the view of physics and metaphysical view, according to the people who practice yoga in this classical manner, this classical yoga manner, and even in other yoga practices, this distinction exists between gross and subtle. And what it is saying is that everything that exists, everything that is in Prakriti, right, exists on a continuum between gross and subtle. So gross being like a determinate object or a big object, like something you can see. And then as it becomes more subtle, it kind of becomes more small. It becomes more abstract. It becomes more light, less dense, and less like tangible. If you think about it, so like as a tangible continuum, a gross thing is very tangible, like a stone, like you can hold a stone. And then more subtle than that would be sand, right? And then more subtle than that would be atoms. And then more subtle than that might be like the particular charge of those atoms and things like that. If you think about it in terms of becoming more dense and gross to less dense or subtle, that is the kind of distinction that we have. So if you look here in this big oval bubble that I drew on the left side of this slide, you see that up at the top, we have the subtle, which is the more imperceptible, the indeterminate or abstract, and the lightness. And then down in the gross, things become more perceptible, more determinate, or more dense, right? So Edwin Bryant always calls this the densification. Things become more densified and they become more gross and more, and with that becomes like further and further away from what we understand as Purusha or our like truest, deepest self, part of our being. So if you just like check, there's some cool like examples along these continuums. You see the yellow lines kind of show the continuum from gross to subtle. And then those words kind of follow the further up they are in the bubble, the more subtle they are, and the further down they are in the bubble, the more gross they are. So check that left column. The most perceptible thing that they have, the most perceptible element, because you can taste it, you can smell it, you can feel it, and you could see it. You could see earth, right? Like that has, you can see it with more senses, and therefore it is more gross and perceptible. Then above that, you become more subtle than earth. You have water, and what water lacks, I think, is either the scent or the taste, right? So it's lacking one of those sensory perceptions. You can't, or I think it's smell. You can't smell water, right? And then fire is one more than that. You can feel it, can't taste it, can't smell it. And then air is more subtle than that. And then ether is more subtle than that. So you can see how the elements kind of densify as they go from subtle to gross. On the right side, on that right column in the bubble, it's kind of following some of the koshas, but we're not going to talk about the koshas, but it talks about the types of bodies or kind of states that we have. We have a physical state. We have an energetic state. So we talk about like, okay, well, I'm flesh. That's my physical body. And then you can say, I'm excited, right? That would be, you could say, I'm excited. My body is charged. I have this energetic state. That's the energetic body. Then you could say like you are your thoughts, you are your ideas, you are your emotions. I'm happy. I'm happy, or I have an identity. This is all in the mental body. And then the least gross, or I guess maybe the most subtle, is we have this gunas that we're going to talk about. And that's on the right side of the slide. We're going to talk about the gunas. But those properties all kind of trace from light to dense, and they densify the more your body becomes less of like an energetic state to, or less like a mental state to an energetic state, and then more further densifies into a physical state. And then in the center of the column, I kind of traced out a little bit of a preview of how I conceive of the 8 limbs in the Yoga Sutras, is how Patanjali gets through the process of creating peace and ease and sattva, which we're going to talk about in a second. Beginning from the most gross thing possible. And on this column, it's like our customs and our culture and our interactions among each other. Then we get into the body, which is a little less subtle than a whole community. So a community is one thing, then you have the body, the individual body, then you have the breath, the mind, and then consciousness. And that all traces from gross to subtle as it escalates there in the bubble. So that's just a little preview of how the 8-limb path kind of follows from gross to subtle as well. That's the first concept. We're going to be talking about gross and subtle things probably for the rest of the 8 limbs. So I just wanted to get this kind of metaphysical baseline already out there out of the way. And then on the right, I'm going to introduce the concept of the 3 gunas. And what the gunas are the most subtle thing that exists in Prakriti. Prakriti, when it is completely benign, when it is completely inanimate or untouched by Purusha, this awakening consciousness, it is basically composed of 3 qualities. And these 3 qualities are sattva, rajas, and tamas. And so sattva is the kind of the green bubble, rajas is the pink bubble, and tamas is that dull gray bubble. And sattva, the quality of sattva is regarded as the highest and most noble property. And this quality is a lot like, I wrote a bunch of words in here in this bubble that kind of describe the quality of sattva. It's clarity, it's calm, it's awareness, revealing, balance, peaceful, truth, discernment, it's luminous. These are all the ways that sattva has been described. And if you remember last week when we talked about a lake being disturbed and then becoming still, that lake was becoming more sattva-like. As it went from rippling to stillness, it became more sattva-like, and you could see reflections more clearly. So that's the property of sattva. The second quality, is rajas. That's the second most noble of the 3 qualities of these basic properties of the manifest world, and that's rajas. And if you think about rajas is very movement and get things done, and upregulating kind of energy, right? So I wrote these words here: energetic, powerful, busy, passionate, frustrated, active. It's associated with desire, motivation, and being distracted. It's just busy, right? Rajas is energetic, it's movement. It is the thing that moves. And if you remember last week, we talked about this lake. This would be the ripples. The thing that's causing the ripples in the lake is Rajas, right? So Sattva is that clear, calm surface of the lake. Rajas is the rippling, changing surface of the lake. And then the third quality we observe in the world is tamas. And tamas is not movement. It's hardness. It's stillness. It's the words I've got here are dull, obscured, stagnant, veiled, apathetic, lazy, sluggish, fearful, avoidant, sleepy, and hard. This is the thing that is caused. It is the entropy thing. It's the thing that slows movement down. It's the thing that stops and hardens and densifies things. That's the quality of tamas, and it's the least noble of all of the gunas. So we understand these two concepts. Hopefully we understand these two concepts, from gross to subtle. Gross being like more, I can touch it and I can feel it and I can do all these things. And subtle is, I can't really see it. It's very, it's like, you can't see the air molecules in the air. It's very subtle. It's more subtle than like your table or your floor. And then the three gunas: sattva, the clarity one; rajas, the kind of active one; and tamas is that slow and dulling. And sorry, I didn't say about tamas. If you think about the lake analogy again, imagine the lake surface now becoming frozen, solid, right? It solidifies and it wouldn't reflect necessarily anything. It's because that ice is kind of milky and hazy. It wouldn't have the same ability to reflect. So think about that kind of lake surface analogy when you remember sattva is the calm lake, rajas is that rippling, busy lake, and tamas is the dull, frozen lake. Okay. Samkhya Metaphysics 101. That was good. It was like 8 minutes, and you know everything you need to know about Samkhya Metaphysics to proceed with your study of the Yoga Sutras. That's probably not true, but it's okay. It's all we need to know for tonight, because I just need to make this next point as I introduce the 8 limbs of yoga. This is Patanjali's system. Sorry, I'm just moving the, maybe I can close that. Yeah, okay, cool. I had to move you guys out of the way so I could see the slide. This is the 8 limbs of yoga, and they are listed in Yoga Sutras, chapter 2, Sutra 29. The 8 limbs are abstentions, observances, posture, breath control, disengagement of the senses, concentration, meditation, and absorption. And I've kept the transliterated names of those 8 limbs on these major headings, and they're enumerated this time, so I don't have to keep telling you, okay, start at the top right and then move your way right. So I enumerated them as they're enumerated in the Yoga Sutras. So the first one that is described is the yamas, and that's translated here simply as the abstentions. The second of the 8 limbs is the niyamas, or I describe these as observances or personal practices, the niyamas. The third is asana, posture. We know posture. It's what most of us practice in yoga. The fourth is breath control, or breath or energy control. Prana refers to breath as much as it refers to everything going on in that energetic body. Fifth is pratyahara, sense withdrawal, withdrawing the senses away from everything outside the body into the body. Dharana is focused concentration. Dhyana is meditation. And the last one is samadhi, or absorption. And what I want to point out is that just to make this main point, and the reason we talked about those two metaphysical concepts in the beginning, because if we follow the trace from yamas, niyamas, asana, all the way through samadhi, Patanjali is working us through systematically from the most gross aspects of our manifest lives to the most subtle. So notice how he begins in the yamas, and next week we'll talk about yamas, but this is like the interpersonal virtues or cultural virtues, or the way we have to like behave around each other. So he's fixing culture first. In the niyamas, these are the personal practices. These are the things you have to do in your day-to-day life as an individual. So we went from interpersonal to individual by going from yamas to niyamas. These are the things you have to do in the niyamas to prepare yourself for liberation. Then asana, we have to prepare the body. Pranayama, we have to prepare the energetic states, the breath states. So we're getting more subtle. We've already gone from the body, the physical body in asana, to the energetic body in pranayama. Then pratyahara is pulling everything into just the mind space. And if you remember from last week, the whole project of yoga is to slow down and chill out the mind so that you can focus long enough to become absorbed in understanding your truest self. So concentration, focusing the mind on one thing, meditation, holding the mind on that one thing, and then samadhi, eventually becoming absorbed into that one thing. So the whole systematic way that Patanjali is working us through this is taking us from the most gross things first and moving them to the most subtle. So set the first things, set the gross up for success, and then move into the subtle. That's why we talked about the difference between subtle and gross, first thing. And then the second thing that he's going to do is every single one of these things are aimed at creating a sattva state. So when we talk about yamas, we're talking about creating sattva in the world, in communities. In niyamas, we're talking about creating sattva, remember that clear, luminous, like still surface of the lake, creating that in our practices, in our day-to-day practices, creating sattva in the body with asana, creating sattva in the energetic and the nervous system with pranayama, creating sattva in the mind with pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, the whole being coming into this most sattvic state. Because if you remember from that Yoga Sutra, like once we can stop and arrest all of the turbulence going on in the mind, once we can still the surface of that lake to be clear, then our true nature will recognize what it truly is, and we can become liberated, right? That's the Patanjali yoga project. That's the classical yoga project. It's this liberation practice. So these are the 8 limbs. Over the next several weeks, we're going to go over each one. We'll go through them all one by one until we get to the last 3, and we'll kind of take all through the last 3 together, because they kind of have a specialness about them all together. So I'm going to thank you guys for letting me prepare you with that metaphysical stuff, and then introducing the 8 limbs of yoga in the next 8 weeks, or next 6 weeks or so. We're gonna kind of go through these one by one, but you have them here, what they are, and we're gonna discuss them more and more.